This was a hard review to write. There was some really top tier stuff this week, but at the same time, the same old incomprehensible arcs for Rhaenyra and Alicent hogging the limited screen time left in the show. This episode wasn't bad per se, but neither was it really that good. There really were only one or two really truly great scenes that did all the heavy lifting, and some more questionable stuff that worked thanks to good performances from the actors. It's one of those episodes where I look at all the scenes, and for about half of them, I'm left wondering, does this really need to be here? What's the purpose of this scene? And that's where the true issue lies with Season 2 and 3 of House of the Dragon. It's not how good or bad of an adaptation it is, but how they are choosing to spend the very limited resources and screen time they have. The show now has 9 episodes to finish the story, and half of this episode could have been left on the cutting room floor, and it's things like this that have impacted the pacing of the show, as well as the narrative flow. When House of the Dragon is good, it's really good. When it's bad, I don't think it's Game of Thrones Season 8 levels of bad, but kind of like Season 6 or 7, where the good parts really do the heavy lifting. I think the opening scenes with Helaena are really important for 2 reasons. I think getting to see the dreams from Helena's point of view is very important. While I think the way the writers have handled her has been questionable, and I wish they'd given her more to do in Season 1 and 2, I'm glad they have given her some narrative focus this season. Well, they kind of had to, given where her story arc goes. But my point is, Helaena being a dreamer is one of the things the writers have added to the show that I think is good and works really well within the established book lore. It's also actually nice to see Rhaenyra acknowledging Helaena as her sister, because that aspect has been so badly overlooked in the show. The approach they've taken hardly acknowledges Aegon, Helaena, Aemond, Daeron as Rhaenyra's siblings, but rather just Alicent's children. I think some of the tragedy of the dance gets lost by minimizing that sibling relationship. We get to see 2 sides of Rhaenyra here, and I think they did this to show her starting to crack even deeper. She does seem to genuinely care about the fact Helaena is a dreamer, yet at the same time, that paranoid and unstable, untrusting part of Rhaenyra starts breaking through, and as time goes on, we're seeing more and more of this. I think they've gone so hard with it this season as to not get the same Game of Thrones Season 8 accusations with Daenerys' speedrunning story arc that Rhaenyra's endgame was not properly set up. I have no words about the Aemond Alicent sex scene. Don't get me wrong, I do get what they're trying to do with his mummy issues, but this really is taking it a little too far in my opinion. After the kiss, this simply really wasn't needed at all, especially if it is just a vision. Now, one thing I think is clear is this wasn't anything to do with Alys trying to manipulate Aemond. She seemed just as shocked about him freaking out as he himself was. I also don't believe this was Aemond simply daydreaming, or anything like that. We know Harrenhal has power in the show and the books, and is maybe connected to the old gods. So maybe this was Harrenhal, or whatever, trying to warn Aemond about Alicent's intentions. I have maybe 3 or 4 things I want to say about the Tumbleton situation. At first, I was confused why they were flipping the battle from the Blacks defending and the Greens attacking. But I realised it's because it's just more practical to film all the Hightower army scenes in a single location than 4 or 5. That comes with a downside, because I think the Tumbleton set is perhaps the weakest one they've done this season. To me, it just doesn't look very real, and very much feels like a set. We've also reached that point in the show where space and time no longer matter. Armies and people can teleport across the world, and everyone has Littlefinger's Season 7 jetpack. It's one of those things where you just got to suspend your disbelief for a bit. I actually quite like these scenes between Daemon and Jane Arryn, because Jane seems to be the only person in the whole of Westeros to talk to Daemon like he's actually really a person. and I think Condal and Hess thought they were being really funny with the Nettles and Sheep line. But given how disappointed so many people have been with Nettles being cut, and her story being badly transplanted onto Rhaena, yeah, maybe try and read the room. What I will say is this. I'm starting to see how they're melding both Rhaena's endgame and Nettles' story together. I may not like it, but I can see how it's going to work. I found the Adam and Baela scenes really kind of pointless. We have an unnecessary love triangle forming which they really don't have time to properly develop. I think the main purpose of their scenes hunting Vhagar this season is simply so they can spot Sheepstealer here, tell Rhaenyra, and thus blow Daemon's cover, allowing them to actually use Nettles' book plot in some capacity. Alicent's Harrenhal excursion is maybe the single most dumb thing that House of the Dragon has tried to justify this season, and has taken the absolute butchery of Alicent as a character to new levels. Having her agree to have her sons be killed last season was bad enough, but making her the assassin is something else altogether. I will say, I do like how much of what happened mimics Aemond's dream or vision, and thus he's very guarded and suspicious, which backs up my theory that the dream might have been a warning. I also stand by my point from last week that I think this whole Jason-born Alicent plot has simply been invented to get her out of the Red Keep and away from Helaena, thus allowing Helena's book plot to happen, as it really wouldn't have worked if Alicent is with Helaena constantly in the show. I'm choosing my words carefully to avoid any massive spoilers, as I know some fans who stumble upon these videos haven't actually read the books. But despite how many times before should have been the final straw for Alicent, Jaehaerys' death, Otto's death, Helena's fate should be the final straw for Alicent. But sadly, I don't think that's going to happen. I think this weird, toxic relationship and obsession with Rhaenyra will carry on right into the final moments of the show as the credits roll, her children and grandchildren be damned. I think Ormund's plan is starting to come together. It's all about buying time while King's Landing gets destabilised, and getting the Velaryon men out of the city by capturing Corlys does actually make a hell of a lot of sense. I think it's becoming clear we will be getting some version of the Moon of Madness, but not the book version. It's going to be framed as more of a small folk revolt, rather than the Three Kings. They've not really set up the likes of the Shepherd or Tristan Truefire, so they really are just going to focus on the small folk aspect of it, which isn't surprising given how little time they have to actually tell this element of the story. I really enjoyed this Gwaine and Daeron scene, and I love their relationship. I think Gwaine is that true father figure for Daeron. They both know how Ormund's plan is kind of crazy. Now, there's been this wild theory going around ever since we first saw Daeron this season, that part of the reason he has brown hair isn't just to make the fake Daeron plot a surprise for the viewer, and to of course make him seem more Hightower than Targaryen, but that the show might actually change his fate. Spoiler alert, Daeron unceremoniously dies very suddenly in the book, at the second battle of Tumbleton, not even getting out of his tent. Well, this theory goes that Daeron is actually going to fake his death during the battle, and just go back to Old Town with Gwaine, posing as a Hightower. Yeah, it's a bit of a wild theory, with very little actual proof, but I have to admit, this scene did give me pause for thought in that regard. Who knows what Condal and Hess have planned? We're so off book at this point, it's hard to predict. People really overlook these small council scenes, but I think they're very important in establishing two key things. Torrhen Manderly isn't some miracle worker, and he has been made the scapegoat to shift the blame for the financial issues from Rhaenyra to Torrhen, but that will only work for so long. Sooner or later, the small folk will turn on the person in power, Rhaenyra. But it also shows how poor of a ruler Rhaenyra actually is right now. She thinks by blaming the gold situation on Torrhen, it absolutely absolves her of any responsibility of trying to fix it herself, when that's exactly what a good monarch would do. You don't put people on the small council to do the job for you, you work with them to do it. Which is exactly why kings like Jaehaerys and Aegon the Conqueror was so successful. I actually did enjoy the dinner scene at Harrenhal, because I think it's very clear that Alys knows something is up with Alicent. She knows she's playing a game, but I also like the fact there is this slight hint of jealousy there. I am surprised that Aemond hasn't already figured out Alicent's plot himself. She's not exactly being subtle about it. I honestly think the whole plotline is just tiresome. Imagine what else they could have done with that screen time. Much of this is trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, thanks to the butterfly effect of making changes to the larger story being told during the adapting process. You have to force characters down paths that don't make 100% sense to try and piece a story together. I do think her choosing to poison Aemond and showing Alicent is capable of murdering her own son does give some credence to the theory that Alicent will be taking Larys's place during the Hour of the Wolf. That is, if they don't just end the show with Rhaenyra. Tyrion Lannister is really ride or die for Aegon. We saw this last week with how quickly he was to join up with Larys and Aegon. Tyrion will happily stay with his king and die rather than run. I do wonder how Larys running away is going to impact the rest of the story. I'm assuming he's going to join back up with them next week. As we know, if Tyrion got his way, Aegon would be heading to Casterly Rock, which is not what the story demands. I predict we're still going to get Tom Taggletongue involved in the Dragonstone plot, and I believe Tyrion might fill the void left by the lack of Tom's father, whom does play a role in Aegon's book arc. There's some elements of the dragon battle I really liked, and some I did not. I think the opening Rhaenyra-Daemon confrontation is really well done, with Matt Smith really showing some emotion from Daemon we've not seen that much of so far. He's taken the character in a very different place this season. I guess Rhaenyra showing up with Adam makes sense, given that the whole Sheepstealer thing is so deeply personal for Rhaenyra, that she would want to deal with it herself, especially if Daemon can't be trusted. The dragon fight was fine. It was alright. Nothing to write home about. I really did for a moment think they were going to kill Syrax. I will say that Sheepstealer is a tough dragon, and he basically 3v1'd Syrax, Caraxes and Seasmoke and walked away to tell the tale. On paper, there's no way he should be surviving that fight. I do wonder if maybe Daemon let Sheepstealer go. I do like the golden retriever behaviour of Caraxes though, the fact he has the capacity to show genuine concern for Daemon's well-being. I think my main problem with this scene is the fact we know the dragon scenes, especially dragon combat scenes, are the most expensive to film by far. So having 4 dragons fighting on foot must have cost an absolute fortune. So it does baffle me they would choose to use their limited budget on low-key nonsensical plot lines, yet cut the likes of the Red Fork, the Fish Feed, the Honey Wine. To me at least, it seemed like a really odd way to spend those limited resources. I think again this is part of the butterfly effect kicking in. They committed so much time to trying to make Rhaena fit Nettles' arc, they didn't consider how to fit Rhaena's own arc into Nettles'. Thus they have to have an event like this to try and bridge the gap somehow. I like to do these reviews in chronological scene order, but I kind of want to do this next section a bit differently. I don't like Mysaria. I don't like her storyline, and I don't like what they've been actively doing with her character this season. I think Rhaenyra sleeping with her is mind-numbingly stupid. But I will play devil's advocate here and defend the writing slightly. I've seen a lot of people claim that the sex scene came out of nowhere, but they did set it up big time this episode with the throne room scene, basically telling Mysaria that she is a whore and will always be seen as one. This puts Mysaria in a new frame of mind. We know from prior episodes Mysaria is not only playing both sides, but actively trying to drive a wedge between Rhaenyra and Daemon. What she does by seducing Rhaenyra is embrace what she was told in that throne room, and use those skills that she learned to manipulate Rhaenyra. But here's the ultimate issue with Mysaria and her story as a whole. It all comes back to pacing and screen time. A lot of superfluous King's Landing stuff. and to some extent Harrenhal, takes the focus away on the core of the story. We have these very minor characters such as Mysaria who have frankly gotten way too much screen time this season. Screen time in a season that now has 1 episode left, and 9 episodes left to finish the entire series. It leaves you with the question of, was any of her character arc really necessary? Did this story need to be told at the expense of so much else? Especially when Daemon's doing a fine job on his own, driving that wedge between himself and Rhaenyra. He didn't need help to do that. We've seen that Rhaenyra is losing it, that her advisors are mostly useless, and she's not willing to actually listen to the competent ones. And Mysaria is playing both sides to drive that wedge further between Rhaenyra and Daemon, despite Daemon's own efforts. The scene with Mysaria being told she would always be seen as a whore was fine for character development, but we didn't also need this sex scene, and the 12 other same old Mysaria scenes that they do each week. Just like all the Alicent and Rhaenyra scenes this season, they add very little, and there are far more interesting characters and storylines to follow that badly needed screen time or development. I think the reason this scene has irked me so much is the fact in a recent interview, when trying to justify cutting Nettles and giving her arc to Rhaena, showrunner Ryan Condal said the following: "It didn't seem to us that a story of infidelity between Daemon and Nettles would be an appropriate path for Daemon and Rhaenyra, considering everything they've already been through up to this point. I think the audience really wants to see this couple make it work, but both have inseparable natures from which they can only distance themselves up to a certain point. And we see that unfolding with Daemon throughout the season. So now there are 2 ways we can look at his logic. Either he was simply talking out of his arse in an interview, trying to justify a choice that was simply his own personal preference, that he simply didn't want to do Nettles. Or for some reason, Ryan Condal doesn't view infidelity between 2 women the same way as if it were a heterosexual couple. It's okay for Rhaenyra to cheat on her husband with his own ex, but for Daemon to do the same thing is so egregious and such a big, huge deal. You have to cut and change huge parts of the story to make it work. I think it could be a little column A and a little of column B. I believe Condal was kind of talking out of his arse, as in Fire and Blood there are multiple accounts of Daemon's and Nettles' relationship. They could have just gone with one of the ones where Daemon isn't sleeping with Nettles. They had other options. There were other ways they could have done it and not have had Daemon sleeping with her. Hell, some of them still even work if you make Nettles Rhaena, especially the bastard daughter angle. And I think this hypocrisy of the infidelity is just not something they really thought through. They didn't think of the bigger picture and the message they were sending to the viewer. Either way, Condal hasn't covered himself in glory with this one. You either commit to one or do neither. You can't dip your toe in both pools and expect it to work out fine. Now, I actually really liked the prior scene where Daemon attempts to talk with Rhaenyra, because it's one of the very few times he truly lets his guard down. You can tell this whole Rhaena situation has torn him in 2 different directions, between his daughter and his wife, which he both loves. That wedge has now been driven between them. That's plain to see. And they managed to do that in a way without the need for Daemon to sleep with Nettles, and then have Rhaenyra acting jealous about the rumours of it, because it was just rumours in the book. We don't know what happened. So Condal got his wish, and managed to pull it off without infidelity, only to flip it on its head and do it anyway. It's frustrating because in terms of Mysaria's character, her trying to seduce Rhaenyra, especially after the whole conversation, makes a lot of sense. Yet I can't get my head around Condal's intent, given his prior comments. I think Helena's dreams are one of the highlights of the episode. Tickles that theory crafting part of my brain. We now have an answer as to what the birthing scene in the trailer was. What's interesting is we see Maelor being taken away from her, which I guess is what she's fearing for her child. I do wonder if we're going to get something like it happen next week that suggests something like that might happen to Maelor should he be born, as unlikely as that would actually be at this point, given the timeline involved here. The Dragon Pit scene was fascinating. We get to see Helaena on Dreamfire. Well, maybe. I'll come back to that. But it's clear what she's seeing is the storming of the Dragon Pit. Now, if this is Dreamfire, they have definitely redesigned her, given she looks nothing like her Season 1 look. But if that is the case, I do kind of like the design. It stands out among the other dragons we have seen thus far, with the colour and the horns. There is a theory that this dragon might actually be Tyraxus, Joffrey's dragon, given it kind of matches the description of him more closely, but the size of the dragon does seem way too big for that. But the theory goes, what Helaena is dreaming is Joffrey at the storming of the dragon pit, with him trying to ride his dragon, and Helaena seeing what happens from his point of view. I think it's an interesting theory, but the redesign is clearly the easier option. The final dream is definitely a reference to the long night, and I kind of loved how unsettling it was with the way it was framed and lit. I'm not sure how this fits the concept of her seeing the future, but the dreams are cryptic after all. One thing I am a little bit disappointed about is we've not had a conversation between Helaena and Daemon about what he saw in his weirwood vision, given Helaena was in it and seemed aware of him. But given what she said this week about her dreams being flashes, perhaps she wasn't as aware of it as it's presented. I really hope Tom Glencarny gets some kind of award recognition for his work this season, because the man has fought for his character and given a hell of a performance all season with the very little he's been given to work with. Considering his storyline this season has basically been filling time till we get to season 4, it's amazing he's done what he's done. His speech was masterful, with raw passion and acted perfectly. It's the same way Sunfyre has been reborn and risen. So has Aegon himself. The scene was absolute cinema, and my single favourite moment this season, and perhaps of the show in its entirety. Was also a really cool detail was how Sunfyre was almost mimicking the movements of Aegon, even down to the manic laughter. It's a very interesting way of showing the viewer the bond between them. We finally get Ulf's turn. And yeah, we all knew this was coming. They've been setting him up to do this all season. And I think from the way people like Daemon have been treating him, the way Rhaenyra scolded him, it makes a lot more sense in the show why he would choose to turn on them, on the very faction that has given him a dragon and elevated him. Yes, there's still this element of greed within his character, but it's much more complex than that. My question is, how long has Ormund been talking with Ulf? Because it seems really odd he wouldn't tell Gawain or Daeron about this. Getting the seeds on side would be a huge deal for the Hightower army, and might actually get you more backing from the likes of Gawain and Daeron, that you might actually have a viable plan. Getting the seeds on the side of the Hightower army would be huge. So when I write these reviews, I write 3 different versions of them. One, moments after the episode's aired, one, the next morning, and once again, that night after rewatching the episode with my fiancée, as I find it helpful to get a non-reader's point of view of the episode. I do this so I can try and take a balanced view and not react out of just emotion after watching the episode. Because I feel like my opinions evolve over time. Even now I think back to some of my early reviews, and there's some things I would definitely change as I've given it more thought. But I found writing this review really hard. The hardest I've yet to write. I stay up until 3 AM in the UK to watch House of the Dragon. And I think why I found this season so frustrating is each episode has these absolute gold nuggets of television that invoke in me the same kind of excitement, joy and elation that Game of Thrones once did. That Aegon scene for me is up there as maybe one of the best individual moments in the show. Game of Thrones level quality of stuff. I actually found the dragon fight quite compelling despite its flaws, and I really enjoyed Helena's dreams and what they could mean. But this week, these fantastic moments are surrounded by an absolute hot mess of an episode. I mean, at this point, I don't even know what to say. It's just so incomprehensible what they're doing with some of these storylines. Mostly when it comes to Rhaenyra and Alicent, and I might as well throw Mysaria in the mix at this point. I wrote my master's degree dissertation on what makes a good or bad adaptation, and why some stories are better suited to it than others. In my view, the issue with House of the Dragon isn't even an adaptation issue. How well it's been adapted isn't the issue we're talking about here. There are countless adaptations that change huge elements of the story, but are still good. It's just, with House of the Dragon, I fear it's just poor screenwriting in general. And don't get me wrong, I understand how hard it can be, given my experience working in real writers' rooms at different levels over the years. It's just poor screenwriting in general, which is what puzzles me so much. This is a pattern we've seen across not just this season, but last season as well. Nearly every episode has these top-tier, enthralling moments held together with hopes and prayers. But here's the thing. I think I figured out why so many people seem disenchanted with House of the Dragon. It's not that it's bad. I've watched plenty of worse shows. It's better than 90% of the slop that is out there. But the thing is, it's just okay. And I think this frustration comes because House of the Dragon had so much potential to be just as good as peak Game of Thrones. It had so much potential to be something truly amazing. And we do see glimpses of it each week, of what could have been. Those first maybe 8 episodes of Season 1 for me, maybe even Season 1 as a whole for me, is just as good as Game of Thrones. And that first season will always have a special place in my heart and evoke so much nostalgia within me. Because without that season, without that show and the quality of it and the way it captured people's imaginations, and reignited so many people's love for A Song of Ice and Fire after being burned so badly by Game of Thrones Season 8, this channel would be nowhere close to what it is today without it. I think I have to give this one a controversial, and I know it's going to be a controversial 7 out of 10, which I think for many of you will seem very high. But let me just preface it with this. Without that Aegon scene at the end, without Helena's dreams, this episode would certainly be a 5 or a 6, which is certainly the lowest score I've given an episode of House of the Dragon. Those moments of absolute magic are what's holding the show together for me.